After nearly 2 weeks of relentless bombing by Israel on Gaza and Hamas's retaliatory rocket attacks, a fragile ceasefire has taken hold. Brokered by Egypt, the deal holds days of fighting that left hundreds of Palestinians dead and large parts of Gaza in ruins. Both Israel and Hamas have claimed victory in their latest confrontation. Crowds formed on the devastated streets of Gaza and across the occupied territories as Palestinians celebrated the truce. But the Palestinian Authority's top diplomat Riad Al-Malki said the ceasefire wasn't enough, saying it fails to address the core issue that sparked the recent violence, the eviction of Palestinians from their homes. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saw some backlash for the ceasefire from far-right politicians who he will need to form a government. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden welcomed the ceasefire, adding his administration will help lead the reconstruction of Gaza. But as world leaders begin pouring praise on the truce, questions still remain. Will the root causes that started this latest round of violence be solved? And to answer that, joining me now from Gaza is Raji Sourani. He is the director of the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. And from London, Clive Baldwin, a senior legal advisor at Human Rights Watch. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. Now that a ceasefire has been reached between Hamas and Israel, it doesn't change the fact that hundreds of Palestinians, including children, were killed, thousands wounded, and thousands and more have been internally displaced. Before moving on to the humanitarian situation in Gaza, Raji, what's your take on the ceasefire and what's the mood among Gazans?
For the last 11 consecutive days, Israel targets civilian targets, residential towers, clinics, media towers, COVID-19 laboratory, the only one in Gaza. As a result of all these war crimes and crimes against humanity, many has been killed, and the majority were children, women, and civilians. And it's very devastating. It's unprecedented because civilian targets were in the eye of the storm. And as a result of bombing, to east and northern of yes. Gaza, tens of thousands became displaced and they are at UNRWA schools. There is a blanket of fear for 11 days all over Gaza Strip, as if the target, the civilian.
Okay.
This is a big shame. This mighty army do something as such. And of course, we wanted end for this aggression, and we wanted end for these war crimes, and we want an end for this harvest of lives and injuries and destruction.
Okay, so Clive, we've seen many ceasefires before, but we seem always to end up back in this, same cycle of violence. What's your reaction? Are you hopeful this time things will be different for Palestinians?
Yes, what could change this time to break this cycle is real accountability for the war crimes and crimes against humanity, which have just been mentioned. We've seen many of them before. War crime is any targeting of civilian on any side, indiscriminate attacks that hit civilians, or attacks which are completely disproportionate in their impact on civilians. However they're made, whoever does that attack. We've seen them many times before. We've had ceasefires and then the cycle repeats. But also there's underlying war crimes and crimes against humanity in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, as well as Gaza. The settlements, which are a violation of international law and a war crime, the transfer of civilians, and the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against a group, which my organization, Human Rights Watch, and others have recently documented. But the one thing that could change now, which is different at the moment, is that in beginning of this year, the International Criminal Court in The Hague ruled that it has jurisdiction to investigate war crimes and crimes against humanity in the occupied Palestinian territory, and it's opened an investigation. So it's critical that it's able and has the support of states to do a proper, full investigation and hold those responsible for these crimes accountable.
Do you believe that they could hold a proper investigation into the alleged war crimes by Israel? Because we know that 10 days ago, at least, over 180 Israeli intellectuals, scientists, authors, army officers, in a letter addressed the chief ICC prosecutor not to rely on Israel's findings into alleged war crimes. What's your take on that?
Yes, well, the International Criminal Court's an independent body in The Hague. It will need access to evidence. Israel has said it won't cooperate with it, but it still has access to plenty of evidence from other organizations over the years as well. It has jurisdiction going back to 2014. So we're looking at crimes going back 7 years. So it's going to be difficult. It won't happen overnight. But if it's given the support, and that's key that other states support it and don't try to block it, it will have the ability to do so. Whether it will do so depends on the prosecutor.
So, Raji, what could be done to hold Israel accountable for its acts? I mean, what kind of international pressure can be levied on Israel?
It's very important to resort to ICC. We are working on that for the last 15 years. And we submitted many submissions. And finally, as it has been said since March 5th, there was a decision by the prosecutor to open investigation about the Israeli war crimes, crimes against humanity, and persecution for Palestinian people. And all evidence, has been submitted to the court. But why this is important, while we are from day one in direct contact with the ICC prosecutor office, Madame Bensouda and her team, I think what we need, imminent and direct involvement in the investigation and to be at the theater of the crime to collect evidence. And we are more than happy, to help and support in this regard as representatives of victims. But what I want to say, accountability, it's a must. ICC, it's not a Palestinian invention. And we will make sure that we hold suspected Israeli war criminals today, tomorrow, after 10 years, accountable. We cannot forget or forgive this Israeli criminal occupation and those who are involved in these crimes. That's what's encouraging Israel all the way along to do these war crimes, because they feel with the United States full legal political immunity provided to Israel, whether in the Security Council or at the ICC, they are encouraged to do more and more. They feel they are above international law, above international law, above the ICC, above accountability. And that's why they don't care. Israel should care, and we will make sure that they brought to the court of law. We cannot be the old slaves of old Rome. Enough is enough.
Yes.
We deserve dignity and we deserve freedom. And most important, besides ICC, we have to have an end for this criminal belligerent occupation. We have an end to this new brand of apartheid. We have to have our right of self-determination, independence, and we want to make sure that international law be applicable in this conflict.
All right. So, Clive, what do you make of the international reaction to this latest violence? Why do you think Western, as well as some Muslim countries, are and were, still are actually, so reluctant to condemn Israel?
Yeah, it's a matter for us of calling all states to uphold the principles they claim to support. Most states, perhaps nearly every state around the world, says it supports justice, it supports human rights, it supports the rule of law. And then they all have exceptions at different times. Russia supports Syria, the US supports Israel. And one thing to be clear, I think, just as we're talking about the International Criminal Court, criminal justice, is particularly to call out states who are members of the International Criminal Court, who in all other parts of the world claim to support it, but have an exception when it comes to Israel and Palestine. I'm thinking of countries like Canada, like the United Kingdom, like Australia, which are still opposing the ICC investigating war crimes and crimes against humanity in Palestine. If they and we and others call them out, so it's a matter of calling them to be consistent, to uphold the principles they say. If they believe in justice and the rule of law, it has to apply everywhere. It has to apply to their allies as well as to their enemies.
Okay, so Raji, now that the international community mobilizes to send in aid and to rebuild the Strip, is there a sense of hopelessness or despair among Gazans, since they will continue to live under the constant threat and blockage of Israel?
We are tired, we are bleeding. We feel sad and bad for those who passed away, for those who are injured, for this massive destruction, the Gaza Strip. This is the last thing Gaza was waiting for. 50 years of belligerent criminal occupation is enough. 14 years of criminal, illegal, inhuman siege, form of persecution for 2.2 million people is enough. When we face this pandemic, like any nation in the world, we can have it, but we have it with destroyed infrastructure, lack of medicine, lack of equipment, due to this criminal siege we are having our body. And on top of all that, we have 3 wars in 5 years, 2008, 12, and 14. And now we have this war where civilians in the eye of the storm, civilian targets in the eye of the storm.
Yes.
We entitled for self-determination. We have dignity. We deserve freedom. And I think we are proud with all this that we have strong and good resistance. We have no right to be good victims, and we have no right to give up. And we want to have an end for this criminal occupation.
Clive, on the other hand, we've just mentioned that the international community now mobilizing, sending in aids, they're very happy over the ceasefire. But even if the physical infrastructure is built in Gaza, how would Gazans be able to deal with this horrible trauma inflicted on them, especially on children? And what kind of a role do you think non-governmental organizations, maybe the European ones, could play moving forward?
Yeah, and to repeat this, as you describe it, horrible trauma has happened again and again. And just only just talking about that one aspect of the international crimes. So providing assistance for day-to-day lives is one part, but ending crimes, making sure they don't get repeated, is another key part. And that's to some degree where organizations and also international governments can be part. First, for international governments, by not being complicit in the crimes, by not funding parts of authorities that are committing crimes, by making some conditional that the crimes end, crimes like apartheid and persecution, as well as war crimes by any side. And then it's a matter for some of documenting the crimes, supporting those who will document the crimes and the aftermath. So those evidence can get to the courts, can get in different parts of the world, including in The Hague. So as I say, that's just one part of the future, but it's a key part and one that can be done now.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining us.